Today we're going to be walking through a Recone job that I performed on a Klipsch 12-inch woofer taken out of a set of Forte 2 speaker cabinets. As you can see in this picture, the speaker had been destroyed, the cone had been destroyed by a cat, and it was, although this is a poor photo, in bad need of repair. So step one actually involves dismantling the speaker and stripping it down to its chassis. You remove the cone, the voice coil, the surrounds, the spider. You use a utility knife for that, and then scrape off the old adhesive. In this case, a Dremel was a lot faster and gave us a more smooth surface so that we could have a better contact for the new adhesives we would be using. It's also important to tape up the voice coil gap into the magnet, as you don't want to get a lot of debris falling into it. Next, I removed the old leads by heating up the contacts with soldering iron and then gently pulling them. So now it's time to clean the voice coil magnet gap, and that voice coil sits in that gap, and the magnet attracts any kind of metal debris that might be in the area. So you really want to get in there and give it a good clean. I used a shop vac, then I used compressed air. I then noticed that there was some oxidation on the magnet inside the gap, and therefore I used some very fine grit sandpaper, followed by more compressed air. I also used masking tape and a business card. I cut it into a small section so that I could stick the sticky end of the masking tape down into the gap and trap any loose particles, and then finally I hit that same business card with some brake cleaner to dissolve any remaining stuff that might be in there. So what you're looking at now is the spider. This part needed to be modified slightly so that it would fit over the voice coil. And as you can see, I made it the hole a little bit larger so that it wasn't as tight. Because once you put the voice coil and the spider on top of it, it's at that point you want it to be snug but not so tight that it's difficult to adjust the height of the voice coil. Setting the height of the voice coil is very important. As you can see here, I'm using a shim to set the height, and the height of the voice coil, in other words, how much it sticks out of the gap, is something I measured on the original voice coil because that was still working on this speaker when I disassembled it, and so I just kept that same height. In this case, it was 25 millimeters, and I'm checking it with a small ruler. Now I'm putting contact cement on the inside of the speaker so that I can attach the spider. I used a medium coat on the speaker chassis, and then I put a very thin coat on the spider itself. Contact cement is pretty potent, so I would recommend doing this in a ventilated area. Being careful not to damage the voice coil wire leads. They seem to be in the way, so I bent them to the center. After the coil is installed, I applied a thin coat of epoxy, attaching the coil to the spider. The next step after that cured or dried was to apply contact cement to the outside rim of the speaker as I prepared to install the cone itself. I punched 2 small holes in the cone using a heated awl so that I could attach the speaker leads as they'll go from the coil through the cone. And as you can see there, now the cone has been installed. I'll note that in this case I had to modify the cone just slightly so that it would fit better. Essentially it was too tall. I had to remove some material from the center of the cone, and after I'd removed about 2 millimeters of material, it dropped in and fit quite nicely. You can see the 2 speaker wire leads sticking out of the cone. Those are going to get soldered to the voice coil leads in a moment. I'm now applying another coat of contact cement to the speaker rim because we're now going to install the speaker gaskets. I started the installation of the speaker gaskets thinking that I had enough clamps to clamp them all down. I realized about halfway through that I didn't, and you'll see here when it cuts, you'll see that I went from using clamps to clothespins. Clothespins actually work perfectly for this application. But these are the speaker gaskets, and as before, I did a medium coat of contact cement on the speaker, and then I used a light coat on the underside of the gaskets themselves. These are difficult to keep in place unless you have a means of clamping them down. And I actually restored 2 speakers. The first one, I used a pot from the kitchen. It was a large pot. I turned it upside down. It fit perfectly over the rim of the speaker. And then I put a brake rotor on top of it. So you don't need clamps. But clamps are nice. I'm now applying a bead of epoxy using a Q-tip that I cut in half, and I used the cardboard narrow end to put the glue, just get a bead going inside, and then I used the cotton end of the Q-tip to spread it around so it had an even application. I soldered the speaker leads to the voice coil leads using just a little bit of solder, being very careful because you don't want to drop hot solder onto the cone. This is not the prettiest soldering job in the world, and if I could do it again, I think with a little more practice I could get this to look just a little bit better, and I could have gotten those leads to sit flush against the cone so that I could have a layer of epoxy covering the entire lead. But I used the Q-tip method again to apply a bead of epoxy to the leads so they don't move around. I did get a little bit of epoxy onto the voice coil shim, so I used an X-Acto knife and very carefully removed it. Finally, I applied the dust cap using some masking tape as a handle, and I used a thin coat of contact cement applied to the dust cap itself. And I weighed it down with a jar. At this point, we are connecting the wire leads to the terminal connector. We're soldering them in place. After soldering, I trim the excess. So that was the last step. After letting everything dry for several hours, you might think you need to wait a day. I didn't. I waited about 6 hours. I threw them in the speaker cabinets, and this is how they sound.
I guess you're just what I need.